scientists are pretty much unanimous about the record temperatures and wildfires sweeping across Europe. The extreme conditions are a direct consequence of climate change and will only occur more frequently and with greater intensity if nothing is done to stop it. So for more, we'll speak now to François Gemenne, a climate change researcher and member of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. François, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Good afternoon.
So are these extreme conditions we're seeing in line with climate scientists' predictions over the past several decades?
Yeah, clearly, I'm sad to report that what we're seeing is exactly what the models of climate science and of the IPCC had projected years ago. And I'm afraid that as weeks will pass, we will see more and more of these extreme events that had been projected as one of the direct consequences of climate change, at least in industrialized countries. Very clearly, we're witnessing one of the key impacts of climate change, that is that extreme weather events, be there heat waves or storms of massive floods, will become more frequent and more intense.
Now, wildfires, Francois, aren't the only consequence of unregulated global emissions. What else awaits us, and more importantly, the younger generation, of which you have a member sitting on your lap there?
Clearly. Well, I think that besides the immediate impacts on the ecosystems, such as the wildfires, there are obviously socioeconomic impacts on labor productivity, on working conditions, on the schedule of the daily activities, massive losses for some sectors of the economy, massive impacts in public health as well as potentially migration and conflicts related to such extreme events, not only in Europe, but worldwide. Obviously, no country is being spared by the impacts of climate change.
Francois, I think you could argue that there may be two lines of thought about climate change. One, that we can still do what's necessary to prevent the worst, and the second, that it's already too late, so now we need to adapt. I'd like to ask you, do you think it's even possible to simply adapt to the effects of climate change as predicted in the coming years?
Clearly, in some places of the world, in some sectors of the economy, we are now reaching the limits of adaptation. And I think that we can no longer choose between adapting or mitigating our greenhouse gas emissions. We will need to do both. And for quite a while, we have thought that we could still avoid the worst impacts of climate change through a massive reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. Of course, we still need to do that, but at the same time, we need to adapt to the impacts of climate change, because very clearly, we will not be spared by such impacts in Europe and worldwide. So very clearly, in your two statements, both are true. It is now too late to stop climate change, and we need to adapt, but we can still decide what is the level of temperature increase, and obviously the impacts at 2 degrees, 3 or 4 degrees of warming are completely different from each other.
I think there's also an issue of perhaps political will when it comes to governments not doing enough to limit emissions, as you mentioned, but there's also a question of what the public is willing to accept. Do you think that individuals are ready or willing to do what's necessary to make the necessary changes to their lifestyle in order to limit emissions?
Clearly some are, but they're also dismayed by the lack of action from public authorities and from governments in particular. And at the same time, I think that we shouldn't expect too much from governments, because many of them do not have a mandate from their voters to act more radically on climate change. And even though most people are preoccupied by the state of the climate, at the moment, there is not a majority of people, I think, who are willing to do what it takes to achieve the objectives of the Paris Agreement. So if there is change coming, I'm more confident that this change will come from municipalities or from private companies.
During the coronavirus lockdown, carbon emissions fell by up to 7%, according to some estimates. Do you think that there are lessons to take from that period as far as possible solutions go without destroying economies?
Well, I think the tragic lesson that we can take from the COVID-19 pandemic is that for the first time, our greenhouse gas emissions were in line with the objectives of the Paris Agreement, but they were in line not because we had chosen them through climate policies, but because we were suffering from the pandemic. And therefore, the challenge now is how can we put ourselves on this trajectory through a choice, through climate policies, rather than through the suffering related to a pandemic. I think that is the key challenge for our societies.
Perhaps as a final question for you, Francois, do you think that nuclear power is at least a temporary solution to maintaining our current lifestyle habits? And what are some of the barriers that are facing using more nuclear power?
Well, this is obviously a very sensitive question. I would say that in countries which have a nuclear capacity, we should certainly try and maintain this nuclear capacity, at least within the boundaries of public safety. But there are key limits to the deployment of nuclear power worldwide. And one of the key limits is that many countries are not stable enough for power plants to be set up there. Many countries do not have the necessary electrical infrastructure, in particular the grid. So we should not overestimate the deployment capacity, the potential of the capacity of the nuclear, especially if these investments in nuclear energy delay the investments in renewable energies. I'm very concerned, for example, that France is the only country in the EU that is lagging behind when it comes to the deployment of renewable energies.
François Gemenne, thank you so much for your time. And thank you to your baby as well for sitting
Thanks
tight during
a
our
lot.
interview.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Thanks.